David Lambert was a man whose life seemed to have been built on the principles of material success and social dominance. In a city where contrasts were evident on every street corner, where gleaming skyscrapers rubbed shoulders with forgotten working-class neighborhoods, David stood out as one of the most brilliant, and arguably most relentless businessmen. In his eyes, his fortune was a reflection of his merit, and anything that did not correspond to his image of success, luxury, power, modernity, was seen as demeaning, even unworthy. He had an incredible amount of real estate, business connections with prominent figures, and a home that felt more like a palace than a simple house. Every morning, he crossed the city in a limousine, his eyes avoiding the little people who paced the sidewalks. In his mind, these people, the ones who seemed unable to keep up with the frenetic pace of his world, were remnants of a bygone past, people who didn't understand the new rules of the game. He harbored a quiet but deep contempt for those he considered backward, especially those who clung to ancient traditions or beliefs that, he believed, no longer had a place in the modern world. Ahmed's family heritage, his appearance and his lifestyle choices had always been symbols of what he rejected. He had often observed people like this on the streets, in stores, and in parks, people who seemed stuck in another time, stuck in customs that he considered antiquated and irrelevant in a society where everything was measured by wealth, innovation, and speed. One sunny afternoon, after a long morning of meetings discussing countless numbers and contracts, David took a break. He decided to go to an urban park, a space which, although located in the heart of the city, had the appearance of an oasis of calm and nature. This park was a popular place for office workers on their lunch break, families with their children, and a few solitary walkers who came to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But for David, it was just a place to relax for a moment before returning to the reality of business, where things really got done. Walking purposefully along the main park path, the sun's rays pierced the trees and reflected off the cobblestones. It was then that he saw a man sitting on a bench, immersed in reading a book. The man was dressed in the traditional way, with a kameez and a veil which clearly distinguished him from the other walkers in the park. It was not so much Ahmed's physical appearance that attracted David's attention, but rather the image he embodied in his eyes, a man who lived outside of time, outside the canons of modernity. David stopped for a moment. He looked at Ahmed, and a mocking thought crossed his mind. How can a man in this outfit keep up with the modern world? This thought quickly turned into a form of disdain. Why would a man of his age and presumed intelligence choose to lock himself into a tradition that he perceived as outdated, when the society in which he lived valued adaptability, efficiency, and speed of action? A grin appeared on his face. He decided to have a little fun. David was not the type to let an opportunity to make others feel inferior go by without taking advantage of it. He walked slowly towards Ahmed's bench, his gaze becoming more incisive. When he reached him, he stopped, making sure that Ahmed could hear him clearly, and said in a loud voice, as if addressing all the people around him, "I bet this book you're reading must be more interesting than the reality around you. Don't you think it would be wiser to adapt to this modern world, rather than clinging to archaic traditions?" The passers-by had moved away slightly, some murmuring, others looking a little uncomfortable, but a few furtive glances were still turned towards Ahmed and David. There was a palpable tension in the air, a curiosity, as if the entire park was holding its breath waiting to see how this interaction would play out. The light wind rustled the leaves of the trees, but around Ahmed's bench, the atmosphere seemed frozen, suspended, like a scene preparing to play out. Ahmed, for his part, remained implacable. He had not reacted to David's provocation, his face still serene, without anger or confusion. He had heard this same remark thousands of times over the years, from people from all walks of life. Judgmental looks, sharp words, insinuations about his faith, his clothes, his lifestyle. But none of this affected him. It wasn't indifference, it was a form of wisdom acquired over time, an inner understanding that nothing in the outside world could shake unless he chose to allow it. With a slow and measured gesture, he closed his book. It was not a simple movement. It was a gesture of transition, a thoughtful act, as if to mark the end of a chapter of this meeting. He slowly turned his head towards David, and his eyes, almost supernaturally calm, met those of the businessman. At that precise moment, something unexpected happened. Where David expected to see a sign of weakness, submission, or even anger, he found only the depth of a tranquility that affected him far more intensely than any criticism. It was a look full of wisdom, a silent invitation to look at himself, and David suddenly felt unsettled, as if the roles had been reversed in an instant. "I think you are very bold, sir," Ahmed said, his soft but firm voice resounding in the surrounding silence. Each word seemed weighed, measured, like an antidote to the agitation that could have arisen. "But it seems that you do not understand what you see. What you judge without knowing are legacies that taught me to stand here, at peace with myself and with the world around me. It is not a burden, it is a wealth."
Ahmed's response uninder like a slowly falling feather.
David felt like he was hit by an invisible wave, a mixture of confusion and frustration that shook his mask of arrogance. He raised his eyebrows, but it was no longer the expression of superiority he was used to displaying. He was not used to being confronted in this way, especially by someone he had categorized in his own social hierarchy as an other, a man he saw as simply a figure from the old world. David tried to maintain his sarcastic smile, but this time it was weak, wobbly, as if he couldn't keep it in place. A strange sensation blossomed within him, an uneasiness that he could not define. This was not the answer he was expecting. He wanted a reaction, a sign of vulnerability, something that would confirm his own view of the world, but Ahmed wouldn't budge. He sat there, calm, with this quiet assurance that seemed to irritate David more and more.
"Bealt,
David replied, his tone becoming more acerbic, as if to reassure himself, to refocus on the position of power he thought he still held. "That's a nice way of looking at it, but in the real world, Ahmed, people like you are stuck in the past.
If you don't modernize, you end up forgotten."
David's words were full of disdain, but also almost absolute ignorance. He still didn't understand the depth of what he had just caused. He thought he could free himself from this situation by the simple force of his words, by displaying his certainty about the modern world in which he lived. For him, modernity was the incontestable truth, and those who clung to the past, to ancient traditions, were doomed to disappear. But in this arrogance, he omitted an essential detail. Ahmed was not simply a pious and traditional man, he was much more than that. What he didn't know was that he had just encountered one of the most influential men he had ever met. A few hours later, as David left the park to return to his business, a strange scene caught his attention. As he walked briskly down the sidewalk, he saw, in the distance, a luxury car parked near an imposing building. A procession of gleaming limousines, accompanied by several security vehicles, blocked the street. A team of impeccably dressed bodyguards and journalists crowded around a group of elegant individuals. The contrast between the hustle and bustle of the scene and the tranquility of the park a few moments before was striking. Intrigued and unable to hold back, David approached slowly, his eyes scanning the faces passing before him. He had always loved observing public events, famous faces, businessmen who roamed the world of big business. But this time, something seemed different. The procession, made up of men in tailored suits and prominent personalities, was heading towards the entrance of a large office building, an ultramodern complex located in the city's business district. David, curious, mingled with the crowd, trying to unravel the mystery of this private meeting. As he followed the elegant figures entering the building, he saw, among them, a familiar figure. He widened his eyes, unsure of what he saw. There, a few meters away, walked Ahmed, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, accompanied by several businessmen and investors. He seemed as comfortable in this world of privilege as David himself. He moved confidently, a slight smile floating on his lips, and his associates stood around him with respectful attention, as if he were one of the most important men in the room. David, taken by surprise and unable to hide his surprise, rushed forward, jostling a few passers-by. He didn't intend to pass up this chance to confront Ahmed, to understand what he hadn't seen before. He almost felt compelled to question what he believed to be an obvious truth. Maybe he had made a mistake, but he felt unable to fully admit it at the time. "Well, Ahmed," David said in a confused but slightly mocking tone, "I think there's a mistake. You're one of those famous businessmen I've seen in the papers, aren't you? Ahmed stopped short, slowly turning towards David, a slight smile appearing on his lips. His eyes, always so calm and measured, fixed on David's, but this time, there was no trace of judgment or anger in his gaze. He knew perfectly well what was coming. The moment of truth had arrived. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't have to defend himself. With peace of mind, Ahmed replied with disconcerting serenity. Yes, indeed. I am one of the major investors in a large technology company that is working on a large-scale project. Perhaps you have heard about the startup that will revolutionize sustainable energy. You may already be a customer.
David stood frozen, shock crossing his face.
Ahmed's words resonated in his head like a clap of thunder, an echo that shook his certainties. He didn't see this coming. He had underestimated Ahmed, and not only had he judged him based on his own stereotypes, but he had just publicly ridiculed him with an arrogance that now seemed unjustified. Ahmed was not this simple believer trapped in the past, an other as David had believed. No, he was an accomplished businessman, a renowned strategist, and his global influence exceeded anything David could have imagined. David's face fell in an instant. What he had taken for a simple encounter with a man he thought would easily destabilize turned into a moment of silent humiliation. He had underestimated Ahmed, the latter not just a true believer in his roots, but an accomplished businessman, a respected strategist and a global influencer in his field. What David failed to see was that Ahmed embodied true power built on years of hard work, patience and understanding. And throughout this confrontation, Ahmed had done nothing but remain calm. This calm which, paradoxically, had shaken the very foundations of the certainty that David carried within him. Ahmed then approached David slowly, without haste, but with a quiet confidence that was in no way threatening. His footsteps echoed across the pavement, and his presence seemed to grow more and more imposing with each passing second. When he stopped right in front of him, the contrast between their postures was striking. David, the nervous man, whose face betrayed incomprehension and confusion, and Ahmed, the calm, stable man with natural authority. Without raising his voice, Ahmed spoke in a calm but wise tone, each word carried by a gravity that seemed to settle like a heavy veil on the air. I advise you never to judge a person by their appearance, he said, his eyes boring into David's, but without animosity. The world is much bigger than your snap judgments, and there are always stories behind every face. What you see as a weakness can sometimes be the greatest strength. David, taken by surprise, suddenly felt very small, a feeling of humiliation and shame taking over him. His thoughts raced, trying to put together the pieces of a reality he had shattered in an instant. How could he have been so superficial, letting himself be guided by stereotypes and preconceived ideas? He had looked at Ahmed as a man he thought was inferior to him, based on external elements, snap judgments that had seemed obvious to him at the time. But now this same man stood before him with unquestionable dignity and authority. Ahmed had not only demonstrated his personal greatness, but had also, through his response, revealed to David a lesson that he was not about to forget. Ahmed, without losing his legendary calm, then walked away, and David remained there, frozen, lost in his thoughts. He felt deeply shaken by this encounter. His certainties were shattered, and he now understood, with unsettling clarity, the extent to which his own prejudices had blinded him. He had not seen this man's humility, nor his ability to look beyond appearances, and even less his way of facing life with quiet strength. A few days after this incident, a feeling of introspection took hold of David. Troubled, he decided to take steps to better understand the man he had judged so harshly. He began looking for information on Ahmed, digging through press articles, interviews, professional achievements. What he discovered surprised him even more. Ahmed was not just an investor, but a visionary. His projects not only changed the course of many businesses, but he was able to bring together entire communities around noble causes. He had a significant influence in the world of new technologies and sustainable energy, and his ability to anticipate the future was impressive. But what struck David most was the way Ahmed remained humble, preferring to put forward his projects rather than seeking personal recognition. He surrounded himself with collaborators who showed him mutual and sincere respect, and he demonstrated a generosity that went well beyond his own successes. This was a real turning point for David. Not only did he realize that he had underestimated Ahmed, but he also became aware of how he had exploited his privilege instead of using it to build bridges with those he considered inferior. Ahmed wasn't just cultivating a position of power. Above all, he sought to inspire and build a better future for all. And that was the real strength he embodied, a discreet force, non-aggressive, but determined to last. David, shocked by the depth of his error, began to question his own relationship with success and wealth. It wasn't the money that put him on top, but how he chose to use it. He realized that he had taken his social and professional status for granted, based only on what he had, without paying attention to the value of others. He had sought to impress, to crush, to dominate. But true greatness did not lie in these artifices. It lay in the way we treated others, in the ability to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of their status or appearance. Ahmed, for his part, never sought revenge. He was not driven by a desire for revenge. He knew that true greatness lay not in pride or revenge, but in the ability to stand tall, to remain true to one's values, even when everything around seemed to be slipping away. He understood that those who judge quickly, those who allow themselves to be carried away by prejudices, are often those who miss the beauty and depth of the people they meet. That day, David had a flash of lucidity. He understood that humility had nothing to do with what one possessed, but everything to do with how one interacted with the world. He understood that each person, even those he had taken for a simple other, carried within them an inestimable wealth. And this wealth was not measured by money or social position, but by the depth of their experience, the wisdom they had acquired over time, and the way they chose to treat others, with dignity and respect.